The Ukrainians have launched a new secret mission called Operation Drone, aiming to eliminate the positions of Russian drone operators. Watch.
Subtitles provided by Simon.
Xavier Teitelman, good evening. Pierre Servan, good evening, Margot. You are the best to accompany me this evening. Xavier Teitelman, tell us about the behind the scenes of this operation, which seems quite exceptional.
What's amazing is the variety of equipment being used. Overall, these are used to destroy observation drones and bombing drones that the Russians use within 50 kilometers. So, these drones are the ones that allow targeting, improve the effectiveness of Russian artillery, prepare offensives, and so on. The matter is especially sensitive from the point when these drones become inoperable. In fact, only Russian operations on the front can be effective now. The detection methods, that's what's surprising. One of the options I've seen on the ground is balloons. They have these kinds of tethered balloons, and under these tethered balloons, they have electronic warfare sensors. Now, the Russians, logically, when they operate their drone, it's an antenna, it's going to emit signals. And then, if you have two balloons that are spaced a few dozen kilometers apart, at the intersection of the two, they can figure out the origin. And right there we can see. They use glide bombs, so heavy bombs. We can see that they have cluster munitions, and we can see that they use kamikaze drones to hit these targets. But so, apparently, this is an operation specifically dedicated to the south. At first, they will do the same thing elsewhere. They have successfully carried out 80 operations to destroy Russian drone teams.
And in response to that, Pierre Servan, not a word from the Russians?
They're not crazy. They're not going to highlight their weakness and vulnerability. As Xavier mentioned, it's currently occurring in the Zaporizhia region, but it may expand. And that emphasizes a strong lesson from this war. On the Ukrainian side, it's a capacity for imagination, invention, and discovery. It might also mean that on the Russian side, they are more inert. That is to say, their observation drone or armed drone command posts stay in the same place for longer. So it allows the Ukrainians to identify and destroy them. All this is to say that the drone war, as we've often said, is the major lesson of this conflict. And the Ukrainians are extremely quick, and as for the Russians, they're not going to highlight their own weakness.
The Ukrainians are also deploying what are called Bober's drones. Can you explain to us what those are? Which weapons can outsmart even the costliest defense systems? Let's examine them. Xavier Teitelman, how far can these drones go, and do they operate alone or in coordination with other drones?
Originally, the Bober was a simple drone, similar to the Ukrainian Shahed. And at the beginning of 2023, for example, it reached Moscow. It was the one that hit the Kremlin. I don't know if you remember that explosion, which was quite surprising. We didn't expect it to be able to get through all the defenses. Little by little, it learned to become more and more effective. And then, in this case, it's something that was shown to me 3 weeks ago, actually the long-range bomber drones. The new thing is that it actually has a camera that allows it to be guided in the final phase, whereas before it was sent to fixed positions, for example, onto an artillery ammunition stockpile. Now we can control it, and it has destroyed helicopters, radars, and defense systems. Nothing very expensive, let's say, but also to make sure it really hits the target. They have a drone called Chaika, which is a drone that will be used as a target. And that's something I saw for the first time. That's my own photo. It's a drone that costs only OT 500 with a 750 kilometer range. It's the cheapest per kilometer. It costs 500 euros. That means the engine is a weed trimmer engine. They buy that at the local garden store, and honestly, it's really, they buy it at, I won't name brands, but it's Laurent Merlin. Clearly, they buy parts from Laurent Merlin. The little engine here is as simple as it gets. And basically, these drones, they cover them with aluminum, so it creates a big echo. And the Russian air defense systems, if 300 remain, they'll launch 500,000 missiles to intercept a 500 drone. And then, once the defenses are empty, the bombers go in behind. So the effectiveness, the bombers' ability to reach the target, it's both because now they're able to bypass areas if they detect a radar, but also because some of the Russian defenses are already empty when they arrive.
Pierre Servan, the Russians have demonstrated their ability to produce drones, as evidenced by the attack involving 550 drones.
Oh yes, regarding the ability to produce drones, they are increasing year by year. I'm speaking under the supervision of Xavier, but the numbers I got a few days ago, it's a transition from, I believe, 13,000 drones annually last year to 16 or 17,000 for this year. They also have this capability. The Ukrainians, like the Russians, have deployed wire-guided drones, so they can't be jammed by the enemy. But what's interesting here is the use of decoy drones, meaning drones that create echoes to deceive the enemy's defenses. So we're still somewhat in the classic battle between shield and sword that's been going on since the dawn of time. And the Russians are adapting to and finding countermeasures.
They're actually learning from the Ukrainians?
So I couldn't tell you if they're learning from the Ukrainians. Everyone also collects the remnants, the remains of the opponent's drones to take them apart. That's how recently we realized that the Iranian origin drones made in Russia included more and more Chinese parts. And they were melting pots. That is, there was a kind of Iranian framework, but there are different components, including Chinese components, that are increasingly common, quite simply because the Ukrainians recovered these drones that have crashed, that haven't exploded, and share what they learn with the Westerners.
Precisely this China-Russia alliance has been even more prominently displayed lately with statements from the foreign minister, Wang Yi. We're going to see it displayed on the screen, where he says very clearly what he would have told Chaika, and he explains it as follows. Without Putin, the United States would only have to deal with China, and a defeat for Russia would be unacceptable. Why does he take responsibility for it in this way, Pierre?
Listen, I think the Chinese, who are quite skillful maneuverers, see all the international disorder created by Donald Trump. And we can see it especially throughout the entire Asian region. There is an extremely active Chinese commercial diplomacy. And then they are showing a reality in response to Trump, who apparently was hoping to decouple China from Russia. It's a way to reaffirm the connection with Russia. And on this point, as with the rest, Trump is completely wrong about the issue of the war in Ukraine and his analysis of Russia. Not only is Russia not going to break away from China, and here it's also a way of saying that there is this alliance, the importance of the Chinese partner. But what's important is that since Putin's last sham re-election, the ministerial reshuffles in the Kremlin have put in place what are called the Pekinois. That is to say, the supporters of the connection, the brotherhood, the strategic alliance with China are in command positions around Putin. And there is a real vision regarding the Asian axis on Russia's part. And Trump can always run after them to try to get both. They are truly united. So that's also an additional element of error in the Trump team's analysis regarding the possibilities of a split. And so the Chinese officials are displaying this calmly.
Especially since China is also innovating in the drone sector, such as with this new device.
I'm holding in my hand a robot that looks like a mosquito. Miniature bionic robots like this one are particularly suited for information gathering and special missions on the battlefield.
The mosquito drone then? Xavier Teitelman, what makes this innovative?
Many analyses confirm that it's smaller and exceptionally efficient. On the other hand, it's so small that it doesn't have any. As soon as there's a gust of wind, basically, it's not able to go upwind. So when they say on the battlefield, it's really the micro drone, a nano drone, adapted to urban environments. Go through a window, check if there's someone inside, and do it without being noticed, without making the noise that traditional drones make. So yes, that's definitely an advantage they have, but urban combat has become something very, very rare. Objectively, it's more around the outskirts, and that would be useful if they want to gather intelligence on their own population or here, enter a meeting. Possibly more useful for espionage than battlefield applications currently. Pierre?
Yes, so they're not very advanced, the Europeans. The European and American special forces have drones more the size of a dragonfly, with greater capability. This actually allows for espionage and counterterrorism. When you know a meeting is going to take place, it allows you to send in a sensor that has fairly limited autonomy, but it provides intelligence and lets you enter a shared space. So I've known about this for, I'd say, about 15 years.
And yet, the Chinese present it as a major innovation. The pace of production is also a concern for the Chinese, but also for the Russians. And this is a concern all the way up to the top of NATO, because look at what Marco Rutte said. He says very clearly that Russia is rebuilding at a pace and speed unprecedented in modern history. It now produces 3 times more ammunition in 3 months than all of NATO does in a year. One thing is clear, though. That is to say, authoritarian regimes don't have the same practices. They don't have labor laws like our Western democracies. But still, there is a production pace that keeps increasing. Is there a way to counter that somehow, Pierre?
Well, we can't counter it directly. Sabotage operations to destroy Russian factories are not an option we would consider. 2 thoughts. One, you're right. Indeed, in autocratic and dictatorial regimes, labor rights, the freedom to protest against the pace of work, none of that exists. 2 striking things. First, the Russian economy is struggling. All the indicators show that there are structural difficulties in the Russian army, in Russian society, and in the Russian economy. 2, what Marco Rutte says is absolutely correct. What strikes me after nearly 3.5 years of war is that you have regularly had communications from the Kremlin about the latest extraordinary tank. The Orychnik rocket, normally designed to carry a nuclear warhead, was once fired by the Russians without a payload. To show, but in 3.5 years, no equipment, very sophisticated, that could make a difference on the battlefield has come out of Russian factories.
Do you agree, Xavier Teitelman?
Yes, absolutely. They're not competing in technology, which allows them to keep costs low, and indeed that's what allows them to hold the front. However, it doesn't let them gain enough strength to dominate and advance in Ukraine, but we must be clear. The Russians produce about 150 Shahed, which are long-range kamikaze drones per day, and a little less than 10,000 small drones per day. The Ukrainians are doing almost the same thing. When we say NATO is behind, it's because we're not at war, we haven't made the effort, and we're not even preparing. The day we prepare, not even the day, tomorrow, the Russians attack Estonia. In that case, however, we won't have the equipment. We may need to ask the Ukrainians to continue fighting for us, as NATO has watched them fight for 3 years without providing sufficient support. That's the issue. When discussing NATO, we must consider the entire alliance bloc. And Ukraine is on our side. Ukraine currently outproduces Russia in drones, despite Russia's efforts to match Ukraine's production level in the near future.
It's true that in European military planning, robotics is now an integral part of the planning process. But some people say, okay, investing in artificial intelligence, investing in robotics for our weapons is good, but we also need quantity. How do you respond to that?
That's good because we have French companies, including an artificial intelligence company, that are present.
But can keep up with that pace. Russians?
Last year, with French artificial intelligence technology, were used in Ukraine in single-use kamikaze drones. So, we also have some gems in France, and because they have been there from the beginning for 3 years, it's almost like French companies were created in Ukraine. On the other hand, we certainly shouldn't expect French giants to adapt to be able to do low cost. So there are plenty of little gems, lots of small startups that didn't exist 3 years ago, and today they have huge valuations and are able to move at this speed. But unfortunately, the big players haven't done what's necessary to be able to do large-scale low cost.
The question is also about the term war economy. Pierre Sevin, many say we're already there or almost there. Many say absolutely not, we're not there. We haven't focused our entire economy on war, on our defense industry. We learned from the Financial Times that Brussels is going to build emergency stocks of critical minerals and cable repair kits. But is that enough? In the face of the threat, are we ready?
We've made progress, Xavier said it. For a number of companies, France, for example, will have a joint venture partnership company in Ukraine with the Ukrainians. We hope that the Germans will also be able to do it for a Taurus missile under a Ukrainian brand, since the Germans don't want to give their...
tourists directly.
But what is true is that we don't feel like we have the sword at
Our backs.
we Europeans and we French. And so we're not in an emergency situation, but in 2 years, in 3 years, things could get worse. Even though I'm very struck by the fact that for several months now, all the solid Western intelligence services, especially those with real connections in Russia, they all say in 5 years, Putin is not going to invade Europe. He will test Article 5 of NATO. He will test Article 5 of NATO. And that's where there will be the, well, if we can't stop the Russians before those 5 years, he will gain more power. He will try to solve a number of problems regarding public finances, as well as issues related to work. Because the arms industry absorbs a large amount of labor that is not found in the rest of the economy. But basically, in 5 years, we're going to be faced with that. So it's always the same. We're running behind because we need just 1 more minute, Mr. Executioner. Keep breathing. Nevertheless, things are moving forward regarding the supply of shells for Ukraine. We've still made significant progress, even though we were far behind at first. But of course, there are obviously perceptions that are different, indeed different, especially between Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. The farther you are from the front, and we are in the middle. And besides, we don't have a booming political and economic situation to really make the shift to a true war economy. That would involve requisitioning a whole range of tools, raw materials, and rare metals for the arms industry, possibly at the expense of other areas of the civilian economy.
But is the wake-up call truly present? Mark Rutte's statements align with what you just mentioned, Pierre. Regarding Estonia, when it comes to the Baltic countries, he remains quite cautious. Putin won't attack Estonia today, but he could do it in 5 or 7 years. So that's the timeline you mentioned. If we don't agree, honestly...
It's in all the notes.
...of the Western intelligence services, since...
For months, they've all been saying the same thing.
They say that. Isn't it that by not stating a very clear threat? In other words, is there more urgency to talk? From 5 to 7 years, will we see a surge within European societies?
It has to happen because, once again, European leaders know this. They have this information. Not that Russia is going to attack Europe, but the phrase in the documents is that it will test Article 5. It will test Article 5. That is to see if we are actually a paper tiger. Donald Trump's impact will endure, even if he loses power within 5 years. But he will have somewhat emptied the Musketeers' clause of its meaning. All for one, one for all. And that Putin may be tempted to do it, may be tempted to move his pieces forward in Moldova, completely in Georgia. That could happen sooner. So faced with this urgency, European leaders must get ready for battle in response to this. And I'll finish on this point. The most important thing is support for Ukraine. That is to say, Ukraine is our spearhead, it's our bridgehead. And so the first priority, I keep repeating it, is to protect part of the Ukrainian sky by striking from Poland, the Baltic states, etc., all the vectors that threaten the sky in Western Ukraine. They need to be struck, intercepted. We have to stop being afraid of Putin, stop saying it's an act of war, etc. We are at war with Putin's regime.
We must ask, isn't he already testing Article 5, considering what's happening at the border with Finland? That is to say, there are tests, as we also see in the Baltic Sea. Isn't there already a test happening? That's why I was talking to you about urgency. Can we really ask ourselves if it's 5 or 7 years when we're already seeing maneuvers?
The Polish are even talking more about 2 to 3 years. Actually, it's 2 years. 2 or 3 years after a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine, that's when this massive maneuvers happens. With 800,000 men, 5,000 armored vehicles and around 20,000 missiles, it's nearly 2-3 years after a ceasefire. For them, that's enough to not only test but possibly attack Lithuania to reach Kaliningrad. And that's a fear that has made us watch each other for 3 years. We've indeed made efforts on artillery, on drones, on the Caesars. But apart from that, we've increased the pace a bit, but we haven't really moved to an industrial scale. And waiting while telling ourselves it's fine, we have 5 years to do it, but that's way too late. And our political stance, the lack of political courage today quite clearly, is criminal. In a few years, we may realize we lacked the strength to stand up to the Russians when they tested us. We will look back on this period and say that we really were
useless. All the more so because we really shouldn't. Xavier is right, we shouldn't say to ourselves, let's just wait. In 5 years, we'll see what happens. It's now that we have to do it, and there also needs to be, in our real mobilization and shift to a war economy, a deterrent factor. Putin only understands a balance of power. A bit like Stalin. The Vatican, how many divisions? The European Union, how many divisions? And then after that, I move forward. That's why I've kept insisting ever since Donald Trump arrived that there would be no ceasefire.
What I was about to tell you, precisely because Russia keeps nibbling away.
There you go. That could have interested Putin to freeze things a bit and then ramp up his military effort even more. But he understood very well that the Europeans, especially thanks to France and Great Britain, would have, quote-unquote, rushed into a ceasefire to guarantee it, possibly through the presence of non-combat forces. But as guarantors of the peace treaty, the ceasefire, and by two countries that are nuclear powers. So he doesn't want that. There won't be a ceasefire, there won't be a peace treaty. And he keeps moving forward. And Mr. Trump is starting to realize that he's been taken for a ride from the beginning, and apparently he's not completely happy about it.
Xavier Stolman, do you agree with that assessment based on your first-hand experience with Ukrainian forces on the ground in Ukraine? Do they genuinely believe in this ceasefire, or do they think it's just temporary?
All Russian proposed ceasefires are scams. The first ceasefire opportunity for the Russians was on January 8, 2023. The Ukrainians were put on pause the day they attacked Soledar, allowing them to take Bakhmut. Russian ceasefires since 2014 have consistently been deceptive. Ukrainians believe that Russians are struggling due to a difficult economy, because yes, there are still a lot of casualties, and they can no longer advance as quickly as they would like. There won't be a shift on the front. So the Russians will be forced to return to a kind of war like between 2015 and 2021. No peace or ceasefire means there's no agreement allowing us to deploy on the ground without the courage to do so. The Ukrainians will be left alone with the Russians, who will rearm and either attack Ukraine again or Estonia within 3 years.
Especially since the Russians continue to gain ground in Ukraine, with new localities claimed by Russia near Kharkiv. Look at General Syrsky's words regarding the Sloviansk direction. Our soldiers have repelled more than 60 enemy assaults this week. A dozen battles are fought every day. The Russians are trying to apply pressure with numbers. What does that mean? It means that these battles certainly require men. So we've seen that in some places it was only drones, that it was a war of attrition with constant drone battles. That means they still have men, the Russians.
Yes, they still have men. And at a ratio of 1.6 to 1.7 to 1 against 1 Ukrainian, 1.7 Russians for every 1 Ukrainian. So they have a balance of power, they have more men on the ground. They have lost, killed or seriously wounded 1 million men, the Russians. The Ukrainians have also lost a significant number of soldiers. But you have to realize that Vladimir Putin doesn't even pretend compared to Donald Trump. From time to time, he takes a break. Well, he doesn't do any belly dancing. He deceives people. Donald Trump, the objective, especially for Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, who will turn 70 on September 7th or 8th. And 70 years old in the Russian army is the retirement age for a general officer. It's 59 years old in the French army. And Gerasimov's dream, who is still a general who deceived Putin at the beginning, that is to say, he twisted the intelligence provided by the Russian intelligence services to make Putin believe that the operation on Kyiv was feasible. He stayed because, in the end, Putin keeps the old servants, and Gerasimov wants to offer the entirety of the Donbass before he leaves, so that Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk, and so on, all these cities fall. And with the hope of being elevated to the rank of Marshal of Russia at that moment. So they will continue in the same way, and the goal, once again, is to take all of Donbass.
That's a goal, but obviously it's unattainable. Since the beginning of the year, they have taken 2,500 square kilometers, averaging 400 square kilometers per month. It's not accelerating since last year, which means it will still take them 2 more years to take the Donbass. So that's a stated objective. They say that Ukraine is going to collapse, that they're going to take everything. Putin admits that now he wants to take everything, all of Ukraine. He said it himself officially. But this current pace is not sustainable for Russia. I believe there will be a slowdown before the end of the year. They won't capture the Donbass in 2026 either way.
And faced with this war of attrition, Russia, she says very clearly, no diplomatic path. And after his call with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump made it clear that he was not satisfied. Listen.
It's a very difficult situation. We'll see what happens. I told you that I was very unhappy with my conversation with President Putin. He wants to go all the way, just keep killing people. It's not right. It's really not right. I was very unhappy.
Look at this editorial from the New York Post. New York Post, we need to remind our viewers, pro-Trump newspaper. And the editorial board of the New York Post is directly calling on Donald Trump to change his attitude about Ukraine. By saying very clearly, Russia does not wish us well and we must help Ukraine, Mr. President, is there a possibility? Pierre Servan, could Donald Trump decide to change his attitude toward Ukraine after being repeatedly humiliated by Russia?
Well, anything is possible with this person. And we've been experiencing a situation like that in recent days. This summer, we'll witness a surprising situation with some paradoxes. So, we have Donald Trump stopping the delivery of a number of surface-to-air defense systems to Ukraine, which puts the Ukrainians in a difficult position, who, in a certain way, through this withdrawal, through this blocking of the delivery of a certain amount of equipment, Donald Trump will be responsible for the deaths of Ukrainian civilians who will be struck by the Russians. So there's that. At the same time, I've heard things from the Ukrainian side, and especially following the latest exchange between President Zelensky and President Trump, where the Ukrainians are not in a catastrophic position. First, they have a certain amount of stockpiles. There's the issue of the $4 billion of military equipment approved by Congress under Biden, which is still pending. This equipment is usually delivered. But Trump doesn't want to deliver the missile systems, which he says he needs for his own stockpiles.
Which ones, for example? All the systems, the
Patriots, all the reloads, if I can say, of Patriots, everything that allows you to supply them, because it's great to have, if you will, a rifle. To put it simply, you need cartridges. And with the increase in bombings, including on Kyiv, the Ukrainians need reloads. The same applies to French air defense systems like the Mamba, Kratale, and others. But the American stance is less harsh and problematic than it was when Donald Trump stopped deliveries and halted intelligence for a week. American intelligence is still being provided to Ukraine today. So, there is a subtle position, and moreover, Donald Trump's advisors are telling him what the reality is. Anyway, for the Russians, America is the enemy. They won't break away from the Chinese, and we are hereditary, inherent enemies. The value systems are so different that in any case, the Putin system will always be an adversary of the United States. Or that to say what's going to happen, is Trump going to change again? But the Ukrainians are less catastrophic or pessimistic than I thought after the latest decisions. So there are still things that can change.
Xavier Teitelman, you who often communicate with the Ukrainian forces, what do they tell you? Are they receiving and staying up to date? About the American deliveries approved under Biden that are still promised? Or is there a delay in these deliveries on the ground?
Up until now, there was actually even some catching up, because there was indeed a slowdown in February when Trump wasn't happy with Kursk and so on. He was pressuring the Ukrainians to obtain something from Russia, which was unwise. He had slowed down the delivery rates, and then it didn't just go back to the normal pace. Production sped up to compensate for the February shortfall. Ultimately, the Ukrainians received more than anticipated, allowing them to build up a certain stock. However, the few dozen missiles and 5,000 shells blocked last week were actually expected to arrive. And every shell, less obviously, means one more difficulty. But overall, the Ukrainians actually have a strategic reserve that's beyond what they expected. That means there are men behind, there are troops available, there's an operational maneuver force ready to absorb it. A shock, as they anticipated a shock from Russia in the June offensive. There was an assault on Sumy, they didn't manage to go any further, they barely advanced at all. The Ukrainians anticipated another summer assault, but it seems it will not occur. From their perspective, they have reserves, insufficient for a counteroffensive, but they're not in a critical situation.
You mentioned the American industrial base. Pierre Servan, we are indeed pondering that question. We've had a lot of American newspapers saying that America is currently lacking in stock. I recall my last visit to the White House under Biden, where National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan briefed all the journalists. He had already said 4 years ago that there was a stock problem. You wouldn't expect that the world's policeman, the leading global power, could have this kind of stock problem, and yet that's the case.
That's the case. And now I'm going to go back even further. I remember my last stay in Afghanistan, 2011. Even back then, the Americans had orders not to do what they used to do before, which was to shoot. Colonel Goya had done analysis of the ratio between the number of Taliban killed and the number of rounds fired. The human cost ratio, as it was completely disproportionate. In the American doctrine, you saturate the area, you shoot, you shoot, you shoot. And then there started to be instructions like, wait, don't just shoot any way you want, the supplies are limited. So 2011, you see, it's already been 14 years that it's been like this. And under Biden, there were warnings at certain times saying, be careful, we're tapping into the strategic reserves. We're not currently at war, but continuing on this path will lead to problems. So in Donald Trump's stance, there's a part that's relatively legitimate, and then another part that isn't, in the sense that Ukraine isn't vital for him, except if, in relation to the feeling he might have of being challenged by Putin at that moment, he tenses up and changes his position.
Can France take over on this, Xavier?
We have the option of using the Mambasante system, which is equivalent to, or even more effective than the Patriot, capable of intercepting hypersonic missiles. Kinjal, how many are we delivering? I don't think we've really increased our production tenfold, whereas in 3 years, we could have made much greater efforts. Technologically, we know how to do it, but we lack the resources. That's what we were saying earlier. Our lack of transition to a war economy leaves us without the material resources to replace the Americans, despite having the necessary technology. If we had managed to coordinate at the European level and release those 80 billion in 2022 today, we would be able to 100% replace the Americans. Unfortunately, we didn't do it.
On that subject, what is France's role on the international stage? That's the main focus of our report tonight.